Okay, well, welcome back. We're going to do Chapter 2. We're going to finish this up, Claims, Issues, and Arguments. Let's just review a little bit. Claim and issue, what are these things, right? So, we learned already that an argument is composed of statements. It's composed of propositions that can be true or false. And so my claim is going to be an argument that a proposition that I am asserting. So a claim could be a premise or a conclusion. Just think of a claim as being the single sentence, the single idea that I'm saying is true, right? So the issue is going to be that claim in the argument that is really up for debate, that is in question. It's going to be whether or not the conclusion, whether or not this claim is true. Okay, and what we're going to do today is look at some different kinds of arguments. So let's do that. All right, the first one we're going to start out with, these are the strongest kinds of arguments. These are generally the types of arguments that people try to give. It's called a deductive argument. Now, a deductive argument tries to prove its conclusion true with certainty, right? It's got to be logically necessary that this conclusion is true. So a quick example of that might be this. Premise 1, if the moon is made of cheese, we could end world hunger. Premise 2, the moon is made of cheese. Conclusion, we can end world hunger. Now, my claim to you, what I'm saying is that if these premises are true, premise 1 and 2, then this conclusion must be true, right? Are you following me with that? So that's a little counterintuitive, right? Because this argument, there's something wrong with this argument. But what I'm telling you is just that if the premises are true, this conclusion is 100% true, no doubt whatsoever. It's a logical certainty, right? And someone posted on the forum that nothing can be proven true. When you're dealing with concepts, when you're dealing with abstract things that you can define, and when you're dealing with logical relationships, like if-then relationships, you can prove some things. What I said about factual claims being unprovable is meant to refer to claims based on physical evidence, right? So I may not be able to give a deductive argument for any physical claim about the world. That's okay. There are other kinds of arguments we use. For like global warming is occurring, you're not going to use a deductive argument. It's probably not going to be 100% true with certainty that anything's happening. Although it could be certain enough for us to move on with. But anyway, I'm digressing. So what we're going to say is that if the deductive argument succeeds in its logic, then the argument is valid, right? So, if the truth of the premises guarantees, this is big, guarantees the truth of its conclusion, we say it's valid. So, do you see that with this argument? If not, that would be a good thing to write a comment or post something to a forum, one of our forums, to get at. But my claim to you is that this is a valid argument. Okay? But that doesn't mean that it has true premises, right? Validity refers only to if the premises were true, then the conclusion must also be true. Okay, so what I have here is, does this mean that a valid argument is always a good argument? No. I mean, look at this argument right here. You tell me, are you convinced by this argument? Is this a good argument about world hunger? Well, it succeeds logically, but this premise here, this premise is false, right? Don't we know that this is not true? Premise 2, the moon is not made of cheese. So this argument fails in another way that we'll learn later. So we would call this an unsound argument. But for now, what you need to keep in mind is that deductive arguments try to prove things true with logical certainty, and that if they succeed in doing that, we call them valid. If they don't succeed, we call them invalid. Okay, right here, invalid. So here's my example of an invalid argument. Okay, premise 1. If you are enrolled in Philosophy 110, you might get A's on your report, your grade report. Premise 2. You might get A's on your grade report. Conclusion, you are enrolled in Philosophy 110. So, I'm not going to prove this to you right now. We'll get to that in week 4. We'll start proving deductive arguments true or false. But you should be able to look at this and tell that something's logically off, right? So if I rewrite this in symbols, which I'm going to do right now. So here I have the symbolized form of this argument. We'll learn this also, but this is good to get familiar. You could write it like this, right? A implies B, B therefore A. I'm telling you that's bad logic, and you can see that intuitively. After all, just look at the arrow, right? The arrow goes from A to B, not B to A. So we learned about conditional statements last time. This statement could still be true, and yet you might not be enrolled in Philosophy 110. You know, just imagine that I'm speaking to your friend who's not enrolled in this class. This would be an untrue conclusion, right? Okay, so again, calling an argument invalid doesn't say anything about whether the premises or the conclusion are actually true. It only tells us that we can't deduce the conclusion from the premises. So as a matter of fact, you might get A's on your report card, you might not, you might be enrolled in this class, you might not. You can't, we don't know that for sure just because this is an invalid argument. Calling it invalid just tells us that we can't always go from the premises to the conclusion. Okay, does that make sense? So what would be, if we were in class, what I would do in a classroom, what I would do right now would be to pause the lecture and ask you to write a valid and invalid argument of your own, just to make one up. So that would be a neat thing for you to do, is to go ahead and try to do that now. And again, a neat thing for you to do would be to post it in comments or in a forum so that your other classmates can weigh in and they can learn too. Alright, but we're going to move on. So next we have inductive arguments. So there are only two kinds of arguments of this type that we're going to look at, deductive and inductive. And for the most part, I'm trying to think if there's anything that doesn't neatly fall into either category. For the most part, everything is going to either be a deductive argument or an inductive argument. Now, an inductive argument simply attempts to show that the conclusion is very likely true. So given the premises, the conclusion is probably true, right? And it might, an inductive argument can give you good reasons for thinking that the conclusion is true. It just doesn't prove that it's true. Okay, but that's fine. So we say that the inductive argument is strong if the truth of the premises do indeed show that the conclusion is probably true. Here's my example. Premise 1, cigarettes are a well-known cause of cancer. Premise 2, you are a heavy cigarette smoker. Conclusion, you're going to get cancer. Now, what do you make of this argument? I think this argument, the conclusion, sounds like it's speaking with certainty. So maybe we should change this to you might get cancer. You might get cancer, right? That's probably a better conclusion given these premises. But why is it not the case that we know for a fact you'll get cancer? Why do we not know that heavy cigarette smokers will get cancer? Why does this not prove it? Well, the answer is just that cigarettes are a cause for sure, but they don't guarantee that a person will get cancer. After all, we've all heard of an uncle or a grandparent that that smoked for 40 years and was fine and never had a heart or lung problem so long as they lived, right? So being a smoker, right? Again, just to really hammer it home, being a smoker doesn't prove that you're going to get cancer. It would not be appropriate to have 100% certainty that everyone who smokes will get cancer. What it does make appropriate is the claim, it does justify the claim that you might get cancer or that you are at a higher risk than someone else. Your probability is higher. Okay, does this make sense? All right, and if we were in class, I would ask you to write an inductive argument as well. So, for deductive arguments, right, if the logic is good, we call them valid. If their logic is bad, we call them invalid. For inductive arguments, right here, if the logic is good, we call them strong, and if the logic is poor, we call them weak. I don't know why we don't use the same terms for deductive and inductive arguments. I don't know why we have to say one is valid and the other is strong, but we do. It's the convention. So this is an important thing for you to mark down if you're taking notes, right? Deductive, valid. Those two things go together. Inductive, strong. Those two things go together. If you write on a homework assignment that the deductive argument is strong, I'll tick that off, right? We're learning special definitions here. These are technical terms for us. If you were just a random person on the street, I probably wouldn't say anything. But in this class, we're going to make that differentiation. And vice versa. If you say an inductive argument is valid, points wrong, points off. Okay? All right, so here's my example of a weak inductive argument. Premise 1, I've seen Muslims on TV that are terrorists. That's true. I've seen Muslims on TV that are terrorists. Premise 2, I know that some people who moved in my neighborhood are Muslim. That's also true. Conclusion, my new neighbors are probably terrorists. Well, what do you think? Based on these two premises alone, does that show that this conclusion is probably true? I don't think so. For me, I say it's hard to imagine. It's not hard to imagine that premise 1 and 2 are true. But that doesn't support this conclusion really at all. What you would need is more information about the general population of Muslims and terrorists, and then perhaps you could start making probability claims. But as it is, this conclusion, we don't have enough evidence to support that. So this would be a weak inductive argument. All right, and again, if this were in class, I would ask you to write down a strong and inductive argument, and then we'd go over them. So that would be good for you to pause and look at right now. But we're going to move on in the lecture. So this is a little extra. I just wanted to bring this in because I pointed it out last time. I told you that science doesn't prove anything. Science just shows that some things are likely to be true. Some things have a higher probability of being true than others. We are justified in having more confidence in one claim than another claim. Okay? So, based on that alone, you should already know whether or not science works by deduction or induction. It's induction, right? Science supposes an explanation for a phenomena and then runs a test to confirm that, this should say explanation. Let me fix that. Okay. Science supposes an explanation for a phenomena and runs tests to confirm that explanation. The more tests that are run, the stronger the explanation becomes. So, I mean, suppose I'm dropping pens, onto the ground, and I hold a pen up here and I drop it, right? And my theory is that everything once dropped will fall to the ground. It's a pretty sophisticated science theory here. And I run the test once, and I run it twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. And more or less, we've all been running this test our entire lives, right? But can we prove with certainty, absolute certainty, that the next time we let go of a pen, it will fall? We cannot prove that with certainty. We have explanations about gravity that predict phenomena in the world and that make a lot of sense. But it's still possible that, it's conceptually possible. You can imagine that all of a sudden the laws of the universe just stop being what they are and start changing. It's possible, right? We can't prove that it wouldn't be the case. So that's all I'm getting at with science being inductive. Remember last time I gave the example of someone who thought that the fossil record was proof of a deceiving God, right? Well, the deceiving God hypothesis is probably less plausible to some of you. It has more assumptions, but it's still entirely possible, right? And I don't know how you would run an experiment to disprove that. So science may give us good reasons for thinking that the Earth is, billions of years old, but to my knowledge, it hasn't proven it. I'd be happy to have that discussion with any of you further. But moving on here. So I gave you this information now. We'll get it again in later weeks. But we also have special terms for inductive and deductive arguments when their premises are true and when their premises are false. So this is just an FYI. I will require you to know this on the final, but you don't need to know it right now because we will come back to it. But if a deductive argument has true premises, we call it sound. If an inductive argument has true premises, we call it cogent. Okay? And I've already suggested to you last lecture that you can criticize an argument in 2 ways. You can either point out that its premises are false or that its logic is faulty, right? So you can either attack an argument's soundness or an argument's validity if it's a deductive argument. So when Peter Singer, for those of you doing Singer, when he talks about animals experiencing pain and this being a good reason to give them moral consideration, he spends some time giving us good reasons for thinking that animals have the mental experience of pain. He's defending his premises when he does that, right? And then from those premises, he's going to draw his conclusion. And then if you think that's a bad conclusion to draw, but you still agree with the premises, then in that case, you're debating the argument's validity. All right, that may have all been a little bit over your head. It's okay. We're going to hit all that again. All right, so the next part of the book is uncovering implicit premises, and I included this in our course because this happens all the time. Implicit premises. We often give arguments to each other that don't explicitly lay out every bit of your argument. And that's okay, because when you're talking with your friends, you don't have time to say, hey, you like movies with good fight scenes, or shows with good fight scenes. Game of Thrones has good fight scenes. Therefore, you will probably like Game of Thrones. That's a really weird way to speak. So it's okay when you're talking with your friends to say, hey, you should check out Game of Thrones. They've got awesome fight scenes. But if you were trying to make a formal argument, you'll at least have to be aware of your implicit premises. Premises that are not stated. So, I'm suggesting that this is an argument right here. What is the conclusion? what's at issue here? Well, I already tell you. The argument is trying to convince the listener of the truth of this claim. You should watch Game of Thrones. Everything I do has typos. Okay. But this is not a complete argument, right? So they've got awesome fight scenes. You should check out Game of Thrones. What premise do you think this is missing? What do you think? So the extra premise that you need is the premise that you should watch you should watch shows with good fight scenes, or a premise that you like fight scenes, right? Because if you're talking to me, and if I only like romantic dramas, then there may be elements of Game of Thrones that I don't like. It's not a very romantic show when you think about it. Lots of romance, but I wouldn't call it romantic. Yeah, so you need that extra premise. Now that's a little silly, so here's a little bit more serious of an example. I'm just realizing I've got no pictures in this lecture. Sorry about that. So suppose someone says, of course it's morally appropriate to eat animals. They would eat us if they had the chance, so we can eat them. This is something I've heard quite frequently, but I think there's an unspoken premise here. See if you can find it. What is it? Well, the premise seems to be that if someone or something behaves in a way toward us, then it is morally appropriate to behave in that same way toward that person or thing. If you had that premise, then this would be a complete argument. And that's important because we often, or if we do, leave out controversial premises, then the argument appears stronger than it is, and it's harder to engage with it. So I would argue that premise, that it's appropriate to do unto others what others do to you, I would say that's not a good premise, right? If someone stole my computer, I don't think it's then appropriate for me to steal their computer. Now you might disagree, that's fine, but that's nonetheless a controversial claim, and one that would require more argument. So when you don't make that claim, when you don't make it explicit in your argument, then perhaps you're skipping over a sticking point, and you won't make meaningful progress with the people that you're discussing with. Okay, so just like having unstated or implicit premises, you can also have implicit conclusions. So, if you're dating someone and your partner says, are you really wearing that shirt? I don't know why I had that example. But if they said that, chances are there's something they want you to do. Or if they say, that really doesn't look very good on you. All right, what's the conclusion here? The conclusion would be, well, you shouldn't wear it, or you should wear something different. But that conclusion was unstated. So this is roughly the same thing as implicit premises insofar as why it's important. It's important because when we're engaging with meaningful argumentation with each other, when we're trying to actually figure out what we should do and why, we need to have our premises clearly laid out and our conclusion clearly stated. That way it's easier to actually engage in those premises. If I'm just assuming that your premise is something that you haven't said, I might be right, but I also could be wrong. I could be thinking that you're arguing for something completely different than you are. So when you do your argument summaries in your argument journal, that's something I'd like you to pay attention to, is whether or not they're explicitly stating their conclusion, on whether or not they're explicitly stating their premises. So with the principle of charity, this is the last little thing on that. We're not trying to engage in arguments to beat people, right? And the idea is not that I can debate you so well that you will feel embarrassed and you will shut up, and then I will look like the winner and I will feel good, right? That's not the point of having an argument in the critical thinking sense. The point is to uncover truth or get closer to truth. So if I can read your argument, and if I can imagine that you probably had this premise in mind, or you probably are trying to go for this conclusion, then I'm going to be charitable, and I'm going to assume that that is what you meant. I'm going to assume the most reasonable interpretation of your argument. Okay? And, it would be, going back here, it wouldn't be very charitable to say, this is a bad argument because you didn't tell me, whether or not you know that I like fight scenes. You'd be like, come on, of course we do. That's implicit. Okay. So this is the last real important part from our chapter here, from the rest of chapter 2, is the difference between a description, an explanation, and an argument. So I can describing something. I don't have this written here. Describing, there we go, I've changed it. Descriptions and describing something tell us what something is, and explanations tell us how something is and how it came to be that way. So these are two different things, and you can be giving a description or giving an explanation, and you might think that you're giving an argument when you're actually not. So let's look at this. Here we have, when I eat ice cream, I usually get indigestion. It's really bad. I'm up all night, tossing and turning. What do you think? Is this an argument? Now, since I've got this as an example on the descriptions and explanations page, you can probably tell already that it's not an argument. But I can't tell what the conclusion is. I can't tell what I'm supposed to get from this. I mean, because this could be saying that I shouldn't eat ice cream, but then again, maybe I like ice cream and maybe I don't mind the indigestion. So this is ambiguous. I'm not sure what this is saying yet. And that's why it's important that when you give your description, you have to tell me why it matters, right? So when I'm eating ice cream, I get indigestion. It's really bad. I'm up all night tossing and turning. Okay, so what? What from there? Oh, you want me not to give you ice cream? Okay, now I understand. Or were you going to say, but it's my birthday, I'll do it anyway. Okay, here's another one. Humans are tribal by nature. Since people in your family and the people who live close to you share more of your genes than a perfect stranger in early human history, natural selection favors those humans who protect their family and neighbors instead of a stranger. So this could be a true statement, right? This might be true. And this is giving us an explanation of human history, of human biological evolutionary history, right? Does this give us a good reason to believe anything else? Does it give us a good reason to act? Does it support anything? Well, you might think so, but then if you do, you probably have a hidden premise. You probably think that things that are biologically healthy are also good. But that's also controversial, right? So if you wanted to make this into an argument, you would have to tell me the so what factor. From to what are you arguing? So does this mean that it's morally appropriate for me to take care of my family instead of a stranger? If so, you would have to point that out. But it's not enough to just say, well, this is the way that humans have always been. It's not enough to give me a description of human behavior or to explain why human behavior, historically speaking, is the way it is. Because it could be wrong, morally wrong for humans to act that way. It could be. We don't know. We have to have that argument. The naturalistic fallacy assumes that the way things are the way things should be. So if you tell me that humans have a natural desire to eat meat, and you take that as a justification for our eating meat, I'm going to accuse you of the naturalistic fallacy, because you haven't given me any reason why I should think that the human natural tendencies are always good. They might be bad in this one case, and I'm sure we can imagine cases in which you've had a natural, quote-unquote, natural desire that you thought was something you shouldn't follow through with. Yeah. Okay. So let's finish up. This is really all we've done here in this chapter. We've defined deductive and inductive arguments. We've talked about these two different types of arguments. So you should feel comfortable regurgitating that information to me. What is a deductive argument? What is an inductive argument? Why are they different? What makes them different? We learned these two terms, valid and strong, and these refer to the same idea, but they're related to deductive and inductive respectively. So which argument, which type of argument do we say is valid? Which one, deductive or inductive? Deductive, right? Valid refers to deductive, strong refers to inductive, and they both tell us whether or not the conclusion is supported by the premises, if the premises are true. Quick question. If an argument is valid, do you know that the premises are true? What do you think? The answer should be no, you don't know. Because I gave you an example of a valid argument with false premises. That was the moon made of cheese argument. Okay, moving on. We learned that arguments frequently come with unstated premises and conclusions, and that this is okay for general speech, but that when giving a formal argument, it's always better to state your conclusions and premises specifically, and when reading someone else's argument, it's charitable to interpret them as assuming the most reasonable and premises or conclusions. So if you run across one of your classmates' arguments and it's got a missing premise, you can point out that premise, and you can point out that it's missing, but the fact that they didn't explicitly state that premise may not be a good enough reason to reject their entire argument. Okay, so the moral of the story is just that in your own argumentation, you should always go slow, clearly state your conclusion, and your premises are reasons why the listener should believe your conclusion. So arguments without good form may fail to be arguments at all. So what that means is a deductive argument that has zero logical inference, a deductive argument that has no logical connection between premises and conclusion, won't really look like an argument. Okay, so these are our terms from this time. Those are the things you'll be doing homework on and being tested on. Let's look real quick at our homework set B, if there's anything we want to go over. So for instance, let's just look at number 17. The following is a deductive argument. Is it valid or invalid? Why? So if there's really an elephant in the room, I would see it. I'm seeing an elephant in the room, so it's really there. Now remember, deductive arguments try to prove a conclusion true 100% with absolute certainty. So let's imagine that this is true. If there's an elephant in the room, I would see it. And let's imagine it's true that I am seeing an elephant in the room. Can you also imagine any case where I'm seeing the elephant in the room, but it's not really there? Sure, I could be hallucinating, right? So this conclusion, it's probably true. It's probably true that whenever I see an elephant, there's actually an elephant there. But it's not 100% true all the time. I'm not sure. I could be hallucinating. So as a deductive argument, this is invalid. Okay? Maybe it's a strong inductive. Did I say inductive? This is an invalid deductive argument. maybe it would be a strong inductive argument, but as a deductive argument, it's invalid. What I should say is, so it's probably really there. Okay? Alright, that'll be all for this time. Thank you so much. I'll see you later.